3 years after humanity withdrew from galactic civilization, the Galactic Assembly held a vote that would have been impossible in earlier times. The motion proposed mandatory humanitarian intervention in cases of systematic oppression. Real intervention with enforcement authority granted to a new multi-species peacekeeping force that could actually stop atrocities instead of just writing reports about them. The vote passed 184 to 20. Crystalline thought of morning announced the results with a tone that conveyed both satisfaction and regret. He said this represented a fundamental shift in how the galaxy governed itself. They were acknowledging that some principles transcended sovereignty. That protection of sentient life was more important than political convenience. That the strong could not be allowed to exploit the weak simply because it was easier to look away. It was exactly the kind of reform humans had advocated for throughout their time in the Assembly. And humans were not present to vote for it. The implementation proved difficult. Species accustomed to non-interference struggled with actually holding each other accountable. The peacekeeping force made mistakes. They acted too slowly in some situations, too aggressively in others. But they acted. And that was new. That was different. That was progress. In the Tellus colonies, peacekeepers enforced withdrawal of Corvan occupation forces. They established neutral zones where refugees could return safely. They brought in supplies and medical care. It did not solve centuries of conflict. It did not erase the damage done. But it stopped the immediate bloodshed. It saved lives that would have been lost. That mattered. The Vrel Nathi mining operations were subjected to mandatory environmental assessments. Teams of inspectors from multiple species examined each operation. 13 projects were shut down for causing irreversible damage. The economic impact was significant. Vrel Nathi corporations lost billions in projected revenue, but the alternative was dead worlds and extinct species. When presented with that choice, most Vrel Nathi agreed the economics could be rebuilt. The Outer Rim Consortium had been exploiting pre-spaceflight civilizations for decades, selling primitive populations worthless goods in exchange for valuable resources, manipulating their development to create dependencies. The Assembly declared these practices illegal. Several prominent corporations were dissolved. Their assets were seized to fund reparations for the species they had harmed. Every reform generated resistance. Every change created winners and losers. But the memory of what happened when humans left served as a constant reminder. When species started to argue that intervention was too expensive, or reforms were too disruptive, someone would point to the chaos of those first 6 months, the medical systems that failed, the supply networks that collapsed, the millions who died unnecessarily. And the argument would end because no one wanted to return to that. Patricia Moore received a transmission from Horizon's Edge Station. Harmonious Frequency wanted to inform her that the dark matter experiment she designed had been completed successfully. The results confirmed her hypothesis about the relationship between dark matter and space-time curvature. He said this would not have been possible without the foundation she established. He thanked her. It was a small gesture, but it represented something larger. Across the galaxy, aliens were learning to acknowledge contributions that had been invisible. Human names began appearing properly in scientific publications. Human innovations were credited appropriately. The work was recognized not because humans demanded it, but because the absence of that work had taught the galaxy to see what had always been there. Amy Chen received reports showing decreased activity at human borders. The probing had stopped. The test flights ended. Species respected human space now, not out of fear but out of understanding that humanity's isolation was a choice that deserved respect. Some species even began posting guards on their side of the border to ensure no unauthorized ships entered human territory. They were protecting humanity's right to remain separate. Jack Martinez asked during a briefing if they should consider opening negotiations with the Assembly. The galaxy seemed to be changing. Amy said not yet. Change was occurring, but it was not permanent. Reforms could be reversed. New leadership could return to old patterns. They needed to wait until transformation became culture instead of just policy, until humanitarian principles were so deeply embedded that no one questioned them anymore. 10 years after humanity's departure, things looked genuinely different. The Galactic Assembly had implemented reforms that fundamentally altered how species interacted. Humanitarian aid was mandatory. Exploitation was illegal. Refugee protection was enforced. The principles humans had advocated for were now the law. But laws could be changed. That was the problem. As long as these principles existed as policies, they remained vulnerable to political shifts. Humans needed to see them become values, beliefs so fundamental that violating them was unthinkable. Helen Price sat in her home watching the 10th anniversary ceremony. The Assembly had designated this day as Reflection Day, a time for member species to consider their actions, acknowledge their failures, commit to improvement. They requested that Helen record a message to be played at the ceremony. She had debated whether to do it. Recording that message felt like participating in their process. But Gregory Hall convinced her that speaking to them was not the same as rejoining them. So she sat before a camera and thought about what the galaxy needed to hear. She told them that humanity had not abandoned galactic civilization 3 years ago. They refused to participate in its failures. The galaxy had since taken significant steps toward reform. They acknowledged that some principles must be universal, that protection of life could not be optional, that justice mattered more than convenience, but she warned them not to let one day of reflection replace 365 days of action. Not to let ceremonies substitute for commitment. Humanity's departure echoed, loudly, not because humans were important, but because they were present, working, helping, protecting, in ways the galaxy did not notice until those efforts vanished. She looked directly into the camera. She said the question facing the galaxy was not whether they missed human contributions. The question was whether they would embody the principles humans advocated, whether they would become a civilization that humans could respect as equals. She told them humans were watching. When galactic civilization demonstrated true transformation, when humanitarian principles were not negotiable, when the weak had protection equal to the strong, when justice was pursued regardless of political cost, then humanity would consider returning, not as workers who solved problems while aliens took credit, but as partners in a civilization worthy of the stars. The recording was played at the Assembly's ceremony. Thousands of species watched. Many understood for the first time what humanity's quiet departure really meant. It had not been abandonment. It had been education, a lesson taught by absence instead of words. Across the galaxy, that lesson continued to be learned. Human advisors worked with alien organizations on humanitarian projects. Human scientists collaborated on research with proper attribution. Human medical knowledge was shared with those who would use it to save lives. It was not the same as Assembly membership, but it was better. It was partnership based on mutual respect, instead of exploitation disguised as cooperation. Kevin Ross had been promoted to captain and commanded Gateway Station at the edge of human space. He watched alien ships pass more frequently now. They carried diplomats and students and researchers, beings who wanted to learn from humanity instead of using humanity. Linda Grant was his tactical officer, and she asked if humans would ever rejoin the Assembly. Kevin looked out at the stars that held both human and alien civilizations. He said someday, when the galaxy was ready, when humanity was ready, when civilization truly reflected the ideals it claimed to believe in. Linda asked when that would be. Kevin said it would be when humanity's departure stopped echoing. When the lessons had been learned so thoroughly that human presence was desired, not because anyone needed them, but because together they could make something already good even better. That was when humans would return. Linda nodded, understanding. In human space, work continued. Humanity built and explored and advanced according to their own principles. They remained apart not from spite but from patience. The galaxy would change or it would not. Humanity would return or they would not. Either way, they had made their statement clear. Civilization without principles was not worth joining. Sometimes the most powerful message was not delivered through war or threats or demands. Sometimes the most powerful message was a quiet departure that forced everyone left behind to examine what they had become, to decide what they wanted to be, to choose between convenience and conscience. Humanity had made their choice years ago. Now the galaxy was making theirs, and in that choice lay the future of both. 14 months after humanity closed its borders, Swimming in Starlight requested permission to visit Earth, and the human government spent 3 days debating whether to allow it. No galactic dignitary had been granted access to human space since the withdrawal. Some officials argued that maintaining complete isolation was the only way to make their point clear. Others said that conversation was not the same as capitulation. Eventually, they decided that one visitor would not undermine their position. Permission was granted. Gregory Hall met the Yelvan ambassador at the spaceport in Geneva on a cold morning, when frost covered the grass and the lake was perfectly still. Swimming in starlight emerged from the diplomatic shuttle, and Hall noticed immediately that the ambassador looked diminished. Thinner somehow, less vibrant. The Yelvan were usually bright and energetic, but this one moved slowly like someone carrying a great weight. Hall greeted Swimming in Starlight with formal courtesy. He said the ambassador was welcome on Earth and asked what brought this visit. Swimming in Starlight said she had not come with demands or offers. She had come with questions. She wanted to understand. She asked if Hall would grant her some time to talk. Not as diplomats, not as representatives, just as two beings trying to make sense of what had happened. Hall had expected aggression or desperation. He had prepared responses for both. The quiet humility surprised him. He told the ambassador to follow him, and they walked together through Geneva's diplomatic quarter past buildings that used to host delegations from across the galaxy but now stood mostly empty. Swimming in Starlight looked at those empty buildings, and Hall recognized sadness in her posture. She said quietly that they had never appreciated humans. Not truly. They saw what humans did, but they never understood what it cost. They never valued it properly. Hall remained silent. Sometimes the best response was letting someone speak without interruption. Swimming in Starlight asked if Hall knew what had happened to the Tellis refugees, the ones fleeing from the Corvin occupation. Hall said humans had been monitoring the situation from a distance. Swimming in Starlight told him that 3 million Tellis had died in the past year. Not from violence, not from war, from inadequate shelter, from contaminated water, from diseases that could have been prevented with basic medical care, all things that human aid workers would have managed. The galaxy had tried to replicate human humanitarian systems. They failed, not because they lacked intelligence or resources. They lacked something more fundamental. They lacked the organizational capacity and medical knowledge and sheer determination to help beings they had never met. They reached a park overlooking Lake Geneva. Swimming in Starlight stood at the water's edge, watching ripples spread across the surface from where a bird had touched down. She said the assembly had spent 14 months trying to rebuild what humans created. They failed at almost everything. Medical systems, agricultural networks, trade logistics, environmental management, all falling apart despite their best efforts. She turned to face Hall directly. She said it was not the technology that held galactic civilization together. It was character. Human character. Every species had philosophers who talked about helping others and protecting the weak and pursuing justice. But humans actually did those things, every day, in every interaction. That was what made them different. That was what the galaxy lost. Hall asked quietly what Swimming in Starlight wanted from humanity. She said nothing. She had not come to negotiate humanity's return. This was not an official visit. She came to apologize, personally, from one being to another. She was sorry they did not listen when humans spoke in the assembly. Sorry they took human contributions for granted. Sorry they had to leave for the galaxy to understand their value. Swimming in Starlight said she had voted against humanitarian intervention in Tellis. She prioritized diplomatic stability over lives. 3 million lives, as it turned out. She would carry that weight forever. She wanted Hall to know that some of them understood now. Not all, not even most. But some Hall considered his response carefully. He told Swimming in Starlight that humans did not leave because they wanted gratitude. They left because they could not keep enabling a system that protected the powerful at the expense of the powerless. If the galaxy truly understood that, then the departure had served its purpose. Swimming in Starlight said reforms were happening. The assembly had initiated humanitarian intervention protocols, oversight for exploitation of primitive worlds, mandatory aid for refugee populations, changes that humans proposed dozens of times and that were rejected dozens of times. Better late than never, perhaps. Hall said yes, better late than never. But too late for 3 million Tellis. Too late for the species that went extinct on Vrelnathi mining worlds. Too late for all the beings who suffered while the assembly debated whether their suffering mattered enough to act. They stood together in silence, watching the sun move across the sky. Finally, Swimming in Starlight asked if humans would ever return. Hall had been authorized to answer this question. He said someday, when the galaxy demonstrated that it had truly changed. When humanitarian principles were fundamental instead of optional, when the weak had advocates as powerful as the strong, then humanity would consider rejoining galactic civilization. Swimming in starlight said that could take decades. Hall agreed. He said humans were patient. They would wait as long as necessary. They would not return until they could do so with confidence that their values would be respected, that their contributions would be valued, that they would be partners instead of servants. The Yelvan ambassador departed the next morning. She carried no treaties or agreements, just a better understanding of what had been lost and what might be required to earn it back. But news of her visit spread quickly through diplomatic channels. Other species began reaching out, not with demands but with questions. How did humans organize disaster relief so efficiently? Could they share medical databases? Would they be willing to train alien doctors even if those doctors would practice in alien hospitals without human oversight? Could human agricultural experts consult on crop failures? Could human engineers provide guidance on infrastructure problems? The requests were humble, almost pleading, very different from the arrogant assumptions that characterized earlier galactic attitudes toward humanity. Human government officials debated how to respond. Some argued for maintaining complete isolation until structural reforms were in place. Others said that sharing knowledge was not the same as rejoining failed institutions, that humans could help without being exploited if they set proper boundaries. Eventually, they decided on a middle path. Humans would share information. They would provide training. They would offer consultation on specific problems. But they would not return to alien worlds. They would not staff alien facilities. They would not rebuild the systems they had walked away from. If the galaxy wanted human expertise, they would have to come to human space as students instead of employers. The first group of alien medical students arrived on Earth 6 months after swimming in Starlight's visit. 20 beings from 8 different species. They came to learn human medical techniques. They attended lectures by human doctors. They observed surgeries. They studied treatment protocols. And they were required to understand why humans practiced medicine the way they did, the ethics behind the techniques, the values that informed the decisions. Not all of them succeeded. Some could not accept that saving lives was more important than following convenient procedures. Some struggled with the idea that patients from any species deserved equal care, regardless of their status or wealth. But the ones who completed the program returned to their worlds as better doctors, and they carried human values with them. Similar programs developed for agriculture and engineering and environmental science. Aliens came to human facilities as students. They learned human methods. They absorbed human principles. And slowly they began to change not just how they worked, but why they worked. It was not the same as humans returning to galactic civilization, but it was something. A beginning. A foundation that might eventually support something better than what had existed before. Helen Price watched reports of these programs from her retirement home. She saw young aliens listening carefully to human teachers. She saw them asking questions that showed they were starting to understand. She saw the possibility of change. Gregory Hall called to ask if she thought this was enough. If these small steps would lead to real transformation. Helen said she did not know. Change was hard. It required sustained effort over years and decades. It required people to admit they were wrong and do the painful work of becoming better. Not everyone was capable of that, but some were. And if enough beings committed to genuine change, then maybe the galaxy could become something worth rejoining. Until then, humans would watch and wait and teach anyone humble enough to learn. They would build their own civilization according to their own values. The Galactic Assembly met for an emergency session 6 months after humanity closed its borders, and every being in that chamber knew they were facing a crisis that none of their ancient wisdom had prepared them for. Crystalline Thought of Morning stood at the center podium and spoke with a directness that was unusual for the Vrelnathi, who normally preferred elaborate metaphors and careful phrasing. He told the assembled species that they needed to be honest about what was happening. Honest in a way that would be uncomfortable. Honest in a way that would force them to admit things they had been avoiding. The human departure had created problems. Not small problems, not problems that could be fixed with a few policy adjustments, but cascading failures that were spreading through every major system that held galactic civilization together. Medical care was failing. Agriculture was failing. Technology was failing. Transportation was failing. The list grew longer every week and there was no end in sight. Scale of Justice was a Dravine diplomat, and his species had been traveling between stars since before the Vrelnathi learned to build spacecraft. He hissed in frustration, and his tail lashed against the floor in the way Dravine did when they were angry. He wanted to know how this had happened. How had they become so dependent on one species? The Dravine Empire had existed for millions of years. The Vrelnathi had histories that went back even further. Humanity had barely been part of galactic civilization for 2 centuries. 2 centuries was nothing. It was a blink. How had they let themselves need humans so badly? Swimming in Starlight spoke quietly from her seat in the Yelvan section. She said it was because humans worked. While other species debated protocols and worried about precedents and formed committees to study issues, humans just identified problems and solved them. They did not wait for permission. They did not worry about whose responsibility it was supposed to be. They saw something broken and they fixed it. Over 200 years, that habit had made them essential in ways no one noticed until they were gone. The chamber filled with uncomfortable murmurs. No one wanted to admit the truth. Admitting it meant accepting responsibility for their current situation. It meant acknowledging that they had failed in fundamental ways. Swimming in Starlight continued speaking. She brought up images of the Tellus colonies where the Corvan occupation had collapsed into civil war. For decades, humans had managed neutral zones where refugees could flee. Humans had organized humanitarian corridors where supplies could reach trapped populations. Humans had negotiated temporary ceasefires that saved thousands of lives. When humans left, all of that infrastructure disappeared. Now there were 70 million Tellus refugees scattered across multiple worlds with nowhere to go, and no one to help them. People were dying of hunger and disease in camps that had no organization and no supplies. The death toll was climbing every day. Another representative showed data from the Vrelnathi mining worlds. 17 planets had experienced environmental catastrophes in the past 6 months. Toxic runoff poisoning water systems. Atmospheric contamination reaching critical levels. Ecosystems collapsing in chain reactions that could not be stopped. Human environmental engineers had been preventing these disasters by monitoring conditions and making constant adjustments that kept everything balanced. Without them, the balance was gone. Some of those worlds might never recover. The damage might be permanent. Crystalline Thought of Morning displayed more statistics. Graphs and charts showing decline in every measurable category. Food production down. Medical success rates down. Trade efficiency down. Scientific output down. Infrastructure reliability down. Every number told the same story. Galactic civilization was regressing. They were going backward. And it had only been 6 months. Joint of Tradition was a Korthax elder who had served on the assembly for longer than most species had been spacefaring. She spoke with the authority of someone who had seen civilizations rise and fall. She said they needed to bring humanity back, offer them anything they wanted, territory, resources, a permanent position of authority on the council. Give them whatever it took to make them return. Swimming in Starlight said that would not work. Humans did not want those things. Helen Price had made that clear in her final speech. Humans wanted principles. They wanted action against injustice. They wanted a galaxy that protected the weak instead of enabling the strong. Material offers would not bring them back. The chamber went silent. Everyone understood what that meant. To bring humans back, they would have to change. Not superficial change, not symbolic gestures, but fundamental transformation of how galactic civilization operated. They would have to become the kind of society that humans could respect, and no one knew if they were capable of that. While the assembly struggled with these realizations, humans were thriving in their own space. The recall of personnel and resources from galactic operations had created an economic boom. Factories that had been producing goods for alien markets were retooling to produce things humans needed. Scientists who had been solving alien problems were focused on human advancement. Engineers who had been maintaining alien infrastructure were building ambitious, new projects in human systems. Patricia Moore worked in a research facility on Luna where her team was developing a faster than light communication system that would make the old quantum relays look like tin cans connected by string. Around her, hundreds of human scientists were working on projects that had been delayed for decades, while their talents were devoted to galactic concerns. Fusion power, terraforming technology, artificial intelligence, medical treatments, materials science, all advancing rapidly now that human effort was concentrated on human goals. Frank Miller was Patricia's lead engineer, and he asked how long until their communication system would be ready for testing. Patricia told him 3 years at most, maybe less if testing went well. She said they would have had this technology 10 years ago if they had not been spending all their time solving problems for aliens who never appreciated the solutions. Frank looked at the prototype with satisfaction. He asked if Patricia thought the aliens realized that humans had not just been participants in galactic civilization, that humans had been holding it together, that without human effort everything fell apart. Patricia said some of them understood. The smart ones had figured it out within the first few weeks. The rest would understand eventually when the full scope of the crisis became impossible to ignore. In another facility, Amy Chen was reviewing military preparations. She was a colonel responsible for border security, and she knew that humanity's peaceful departure did not guarantee a peaceful future. Some species might decide that forcing humans to return was easier than adapting to human absence. Earth needed to be ready for that possibility. Jack Martinez was her tactical officer, and he reported that all border stations were fully operational. Fleet deployments were in position. If anyone tried to cross into human space without permission, they would be intercepted and escorted back out. Force would only be used if necessary, but humans were prepared to use it. Amy asked if there had been any incidents. Jack told her about 17 probe ships from different species. All had been detected approaching human borders. All had been met by human patrol craft. All had been told firmly but politely that human space was closed until further notice. Most had complied immediately. A few required more aggressive warning maneuvers before they turned back, but none had actually violated the border. Amy studied the star charts showing human territory. It was smaller than many galactic empires. Humans controlled maybe 300 systems compared to the thousands controlled by species like the Korthax or Dravine. But it was theirs. Every world, every station, every ship, all human, all operating according to human values, all building toward a human future. She told Jack to make sure every patrol captain understood the rules of engagement. Humans were not returning to the assembly, but humans were not going to war either. They would be firm. They would be clear. They would be absolutely immovable, but they would not be aggressive. The goal was to make it obvious that human isolation was a choice that deserved respect. Jack confirmed he would relay those orders. As months turned into a year, the galactic situation continued to deteriorate. Not catastrophically. Civilization did not collapse completely, but the smooth efficiency that had characterized the past century gave way to constant friction and delay and failure. Things that used to work stopped working. Systems that used to be reliable became unpredictable, and everywhere people looked they found gaps where human effort used to be. The assembly formed committees to study the problem. They wrote reports analyzing what had gone wrong. They proposed reforms and restructuring and new initiatives, but none of it addressed the fundamental issue. They had built a civilization that depended on one species doing more than their share, and that species had decided to stop. Now the galaxy would have to learn to function without humans, or it would have to learn to deserve having humans back. Those were the only options. And the choice would reveal what galactic civilization really was beneath all its grand pronouncements, about unity and cooperation and shared destiny. Behind closed borders, humanity watched and waited and built their own future. They were patient. 3 months had passed since Helen Price walked out of the Galactic Assembly, and now Lisa Grant stood on Horizon's Edge Station, watching the last human ships prepare to leave. The station floated in deep space far from any star, and it had been built to study the strange dark places between galaxies, where matter behaved in ways no one understood. Humans and Vrelnathi had worked together here for 6 years, and Lisa had thought they were partners. She was learning that she had been wrong about what partnership meant. The observation deck gave her a view of the entire docking bay where 5 transport ships were being loaded with equipment and personal belongings. Human crew members were carrying boxes and checking manifests and saying goodbye to alien co-workers they had spent years with. Some of those goodbyes looked friendly. Others looked awkward. A few aliens seemed angry. Most just seemed confused. Kevin Ross stood next to Lisa holding a data pad and reading off departure schedules. He was her second in command, and he had a gift for logistics that made complicated operations look easy. He told Lisa that all personnel would be aboard within 3 hours. All critical systems had been transferred to Vrelnathi control. All documentation had been delivered. They were on schedule. Lisa nodded, but she was not really listening. She was watching Harmonious Frequency approach from across the deck. He was the Vrelnathi director of the station, and his crystalline body was dim in a way that suggested distress. Vrelnathi communicated emotion through light and color, and right now, Harmonious Frequency looked like a storm cloud. He asked Lisa if some humans could stay just a little longer, just until the Vrelnathi staff learned how to handle the quantum resonance chamber on their own. That equipment was delicate and complicated, and the calibration had to be perfect, or the whole experiment would fail. Only human engineers really understood how it worked. Lisa had been expecting this conversation. She told Harmonious Frequency that complete documentation for every system on the station had been provided weeks ago. The Vrelnathi had the instructions. They had the training materials. They had detailed videos showing every procedure. Everything they needed to operate the station was in their possession. What they did not have was experience doing the work themselves, because humans had always done it for them. Harmonious Frequency flickered in what Lisa recognized as frustration. He said the research was too important to risk. They were close to understanding fundamental truths about the universe. This work benefited every species in the galaxy. Surely that mattered more than politics. Lisa looked at the alien she had worked beside for 6 years. She had respected him. She had thought he respected her and her team. Now she was seeing something she had not noticed before. He respected the work humans did, but he had never really valued the humans doing it. She pulled up files on her own datapad and showed Harmonious Frequency the statistics. In 6 years, human scientists had made 73% of the breakthrough discoveries on this station. Humans wrote 88% of the research papers. Humans designed 92% of the experimental equipment. Humans maintained all critical systems, and yet when those research papers were published, the human names always appeared at the bottom of the author list. The Vrelnathi names came first. The credit went to the beings who had contributed the least. Harmonious Frequency went very dim. He said he had not realized the imbalance was so large. He had thought the work was more evenly distributed. Lisa told him that was the problem. None of them had realized. The Vrelnathi had become so used to human effort that they stopped seeing it. They stopped appreciating it. They stopped valuing the people doing it. When something worked smoothly, they assumed it was supposed to work that way. They never asked who was making it work or what it cost those people to maintain that illusion of ease. The last transport sealed its loading doors, and the departure alarm sounded through the station. Lisa picked up her bag and took one final look at Horizon's edge. She had been proud of the work done here. The discoveries made on this station would be studied for generations. She just wished her name and the names of her colleagues would be properly attached to those discoveries. Kevin asked her if she thought the Vrelnathi would be able to manage without human help. Lisa said yes, eventually. The Vrelnathi were intelligent and capable. They would figure it out. The question was what they would learn in the process of figuring it out. Whether they would learn to value the work that had been invisible to them, whether they would understand what they had taken for granted. The transport departed, and Horizon's edge grew smaller in the viewport until it was just another point of light among billions. Lisa watched it disappear and thought about all the other stations and facilities across the galaxy where similar scenes were playing out. Humans coming home, aliens discovering gaps they had not known existed. On the Korthax homeworld, the largest medical complex in that region of space was facing a crisis. For 20 years, it had maintained a 98% survival rate for diseases that used to be death sentences. Patients came from 40 different species to be treated there. It was considered a miracle of modern medicine. What most people did not know was that 80% of the doctors and 90% of the medical researchers at that facility were human. When the humans left, the survival rate dropped to 73% in the first month. Patients who would have lived were dying. The Korthax administrators scrambled to find replacements, but they quickly learned that you could not replace decades of human medical knowledge with a few rushed training sessions. Medicine was complicated. Human doctors had not just been following procedures. They had been innovating and adapting and solving problems in real time. Without them, the facility was just a building full of expensive equipment that no one quite knew how to use properly. On the Yelvan agricultural worlds, the miracle crops that had ended hunger across 40 planets started to fail. Yields dropped by 30%, then 40%. The Yelvan administrators checked the procedures and found that humans had been adjusting fertilizer mixtures and irrigation schedules and pest control measures on a daily basis. Those adjustments had never been written down because they required judgment and experience. The Yelvan farmers were following the basic guidelines, but they did not have the expertise to adapt when conditions changed. Food shortages began appearing for the first time in a generation. The galactic trade network that connected thousands of worlds started experiencing delays. Ships arrived at the wrong times. Cargo was lost. Supply chains broke down. It turned out that human logistics coordinators had been managing a system so complex that even they did not fully understand all its moving parts. They had kept it running through a combination of skill and intuition and constant attention. Without them, the system began to fail in ways that cascaded through the entire economy. On Earth, Helen Price sat in her home and watched the news reports coming in from across the galaxy. Species after species was issuing statements. Some demanded that humans return immediately. Some offered incentives and bribes. Some threatened consequences. A few admitted they had made mistakes and asked for another chance. Gregory Hall called her from his new office at Human Central Command. He had taken over as the primary liaison between humanity and the rest of the galaxy. It was not a diplomatic position anymore, because humans were no longer engaging in diplomacy. It was more like a customer service role. Someone had to answer all the messages flooding in from aliens who were panicking. He told Helen that the Galactic Assembly had sent 17 formal requests for negotiation in just the past week. Every single one asked when humans would be coming back. Every single one assumed that humans had made their point and now it was time to return to normal. Helen asked what he was telling them. Gregory said he was following her instructions. He told every alien who contacted him that humanity was no longer interested in galactic affairs. Humans wished all species well. Humans hoped they would solve their problems. But humans would not be returning to help them. Not now and maybe not ever. Helen smiled. It was not a happy smile exactly. It was more satisfied. She told Gregory to keep giving them that same message. No negotiations. No conditions. No timeline for reconsideration. Just a simple statement that humans were done and they needed to accept that. She knew what would happen next. The aliens would try to solve their problems without human help. Some would succeed. Many would fail. And slowly they would begin to understand what they had lost. Not just the labor and the expertise and the innovations, but the values that humans brought to every interaction, the belief that helping others mattered, that protecting the weak was more important than protecting the powerful, that justice was not negotiable. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson and Helen felt no satisfaction in that. She had not wanted to teach them this way. She had wanted them to listen when humans spoke in the assembly. She had wanted them to vote differently when refugees needed help or primitive worlds needed protection, or occupations needed to end, but they had not listened. So now they would learn through experience what words could not teach them. 3 months of human absence had created chaos. 6 months would create crisis. A year would create catastrophe. And somewhere in that, Helen Price had been speaking to aliens for most of her adult life, and today would be the last time she would do it as Earth's representative to the Galactic Assembly. She stood at the human podium in the massive circular chamber and looked around at the thousands of beings from 212 different worlds. Some looked like crystals that caught the light and threw it back in rainbow patterns. Some had 6 arms and scales that shimmered when they moved. Some were small and wet, and reminded her of the frogs she had caught as a child near her grandmother's pond. All of them were waiting to hear what she had to say, and none of them expected what was coming. The chamber was built in rings that went up so high the top disappeared into shadow. The oldest species sat closest to the center, because that was how things had always been done. The Vrelnathi were there in the front row, and they had been traveling between stars since before humans learned to make fire. Behind them were the Korthax, who ruled over 60 planets and never let anyone forget it. Then came the Yelvan and the Dravine and dozens of others whose names Helen had memorized over decades of careful diplomatic work. She had not written a long speech because long speeches were not her style. She believed in saying what needed to be said and then sitting down. Today she would say something that would shake every being in this chamber, even if They did not know it yet. Helen touched the control on her podium and her voice was translated into every language spoken in the galaxy. The technology for that still amazed her even after all these years. She spoke clearly and calmly as she always did. Humanity was leaving the Galactic Assembly. They were going home. Every human diplomat and scientist and doctor and engineer working on alien worlds would pack up and return to human space. Every treaty would be honored and every agreement would be fulfilled, but humans would no longer be part of this council. It was over. They were done. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds before the chamber exploded into noise. Aliens were shouting in languages that sounded like music or grinding rocks or water flowing over stones. The translation field hummed so loudly trying to keep up that Helen could feel it vibrating in her teeth. Crystalline thought of Morning was the leader of the Vrelnati, and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. He wanted to know how humans could just leave. There were treaties that connected human worlds to alien worlds across 300 star systems. There were trade routes and research projects and medical facilities. Humanity could not simply walk away from all of that. Helen told him that every treaty would be respected. Every contract would be fulfilled. No one would be left in the cold. Humans had prepared documents for every single partnership, and those documents were already being delivered to the appropriate offices. This was not a sudden decision made in anger. This had been planned carefully. A Korthax representative stood and her 6 arms waved in patterns that Helen had learned meant extreme agitation. She asked why humans were doing this. There had been disagreements over the years, but that was normal. Different species saw things differently. They had lived in peace for almost 200 years. What had changed? Helen looked at that Korthax representative and remembered voting with her on agricultural reforms 5 years ago. They had worked together on that project for months, but they had also been on opposite sides of dozens of other votes. Votes about things that mattered more than crop yields. She told the chamber that humans had watched and learned for 2 centuries. They had participated in this grand experiment of bringing different species together to work toward common goals. But over time, humans had come to understand that they did not belong here, not because they were lesser or greater than anyone else, but because their values did not match what this council believed in. A small Yelvan named Swimming in Starlight spoke up. Her voice was confused and hurt. She said that humans had given so much to the galaxy. Human scientists had made discoveries that helped every species. Human doctors had cured diseases that had killed billions. Human engineers had built things that made life better across hundreds of worlds. How could they say they did not belong? Helen had expected this question, and she had her answer ready. She brought up images on the central display. Pictures of the Tellus colonies under Corvan occupation. 6 worlds where the native population was being forced to work in mines that destroyed their bodies. Humans had proposed intervention 3 times. 3 times the assembly had voted no. Internal matter, they said. Not our business, they said. She showed pictures of the Vrelnati mining operations on primitive worlds. Beautiful planets with forests and oceans turned into dead rocks. Species that had not yet developed space travel watching their homes destroyed by aliens they could not fight. Humans had proposed protection laws. The assembly voted no. Economic freedom, they said. Progress, they said. She showed refugee camps where millions of beings lived in conditions that would make a human weep. Camps that existed because the assembly refused to get involved in conflicts between member species. Humans had proposed humanitarian aid requirements. The assembly voted no. Voluntary charity, they said. We cannot force generosity, they said. Crystalline thought of Morning said those were all internal matters. The assembly did not interfere in how species ran their own affairs. That was the foundation of galactic peace. Helen nodded slowly. She said that was exactly why humans were leaving. This council had chosen to protect the powerful instead of defending the weak. It had chosen convenience over justice. It had chosen to look away from suffering rather than do the hard work of preventing it. Humans could not be part of that anymore. They would not sit in this chamber and vote no when people needed help. They would not write reports about atrocities and then file those reports away. They were done pretending that neutrality was the same as morality. She placed a data crystal on her podium. Everything the assembly needed to know about humanity's departure was in that crystal. Contact information for transition managers, schedules for facility transfers, legal documents releasing humans from their obligations, while ensuring no one was harmed by their leaving. It was all there. Clean and professional and final. Helen picked up her personal items from the podium. Her aide Peter Cole was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was young and had only been working in the diplomatic corps for 3 years. He had been excited to get this assignment. Now he looked sad. He asked Helen quietly if she thought the aliens understood why this was happening. Helen told him no. Not yet, but they would understand eventually. When the humans who kept their hospitals running went home. When the humans who managed their supply network stopped showing up for work. When the humans who had quietly been holding galactic civilization together for 200 years were no longer there to catch all the things that were falling apart. Then they would understand. Behind them, the assembly chamber was in chaos. Aliens were arguing and demanding explanations and trying to figure out what this meant for their own worlds. But Helen and Peter kept walking toward the exit. They did not look back. There was nothing behind them anymore. Everything humans cared about was ahead, waiting for them to come home.